Heat waves and wildfires are on the top of the news agenda at the moment. On Thursday, we saw the hottest day of an already record-breaking year. It was 38.1 degrees in Kew in West London. And these were some of the dramatic scenes broadcast into our respective living rooms.
Let's just bring you back to these live pictures that we are getting from the Sky News helicopter this evening. And they show serious fires that have broken out in Stourbridge in the West Midlands. And there was a fire that it involved the golf course there and several fields there. But that fire, as you can see there, has crossed roads and is now seriously impacting residential areas.
Firefighters were called to this part of Stourbridge at about 1:30 yesterday afternoon, and what's really striking when you talk to people who live here is the speed at which the fire took hold. It started off in a field, then blew onto the golf course, which is next to us here, and then the wind changed direction and sent it towards houses down here. Now we know it's more than 10 houses that have been gutted by the fire that happened here yesterday. People who live here have been telling us it was carnage, that they can't believe something like that happened in this country, and it was more like being in a film.
Okay, I've got to get out of here now. I've got to go. So that's it. That's the house going up.
That was footage from Sky, the BBC and social media of those, really apocalyptic looking fires in Stourbridge on Thursday. Now, you might have thought scenes like that would put fires front and centre of the political agenda. You might have expected that Andy Burnham would use this opportunity to really talk about climate change and the threat it faces to our health, our safety, our living standards. However, the new Prime Minister has been very reluctant to talk about climate change. He doesn't think it fits with the messaging that he's trying to put forward in his new government. And we aren't the only people to have noticed this silence. Today, 50 Green groups, including Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, have urged Burnham to break his silence on climate change. There is, though, one key figure in the new government who is speaking from a different script, someone who hasn't decided that climate change are two words that shouldn't be said in public. This is Foreign Secretary Ed Miliband.
This isn't normal. Or this, or this. These heat waves are sending us a message. We can all agree that national security is the first responsibility of any government, and the climate crisis is now a serious national security threat to the British people. Heat waves, wildfires, droughts are all going to become more common, but the good news is we can act. As Foreign Secretary, I will work with countries around the world to build a coalition for action. At the United Nations in September, I'll be bringing together foreign ministers to discuss how we respond to this new national security threat. And when countries work together, we can bring down emissions, slow temperature rises, and help people adapt to the warming world. I feel this so deeply. We owe it to future generations to act. Our planet is sending us a warning signal, and we are going to listen.
Now, for Ed Miliband, of course, Foreign Secretary was a bit of a consolation prize. He wanted to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that was a job he'd been prepping for years. I think he planned to go into the Treasury and turbocharge Britain's transition to net zero. But can he now, as Foreign Secretary, make more of a difference than he could have done as Chancellor? Are the opportunities even bigger, even wider? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Simon Lewis. He's Professor of Global Change Science at UCL.
It's much trickier, I think, to be impactful on the international stage if your government is not performing on the national stage. So it's going to be tough for Ed Miliband if these two new oil and gas licenses, Rosebank and Jackdaw, get approved, and that could be very soon. Then he's going to have a real trouble telling the rest of the world, hey, we need to get our emissions down, if they're also back home granting new licenses for, 25 years worth of new oil and gas emissions.
And who would that matter to? Because obviously the argument for Jackdaw and Rosebank, there are a number of arguments for it, but when it comes to climate, people say, look, Britain's emissions aren't that significant, even if they open these new oil and gas plants. And it's not as if Xi Jinping really cares what the UK government is doing when it comes to the North Sea. I mean, do you disagree with that, or what countries would be influenced, let's say, by us giving those to gas and oil fields the go-ahead?
So I think we all know that the UN process is quite bogged down because it is consensus-based and real leadership is required. And there's a parallel process now with this roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels, had its first conference in Colombia this year. And it could lead that. It could provide a real leadership role as a, middle power country who has a good track record compared to other countries in terms of climate. Officially our emissions since 1990 are 54% down, by other measures, a quarter down. Not enough, and certainly not in line with 1.5 degrees C, but significantly better than many other countries. So could provide leadership there, but not if we're giving oil and gas licenses out at home.
Could you give a bit more context to this treaty? It has been mentioned on the show before, but this is a sort of coalition of the willing, isn't it? Separate from the COP process, and for countries who have committed to move away from fossil fuels, and I think to not sort of develop any new fossil fuel sites.
That's right. There's a frustration in the climate talks that things get bogged down by what, for example, Saudi Arabia is willing to sign up to, which is very, very little. So now we all agree that we need to get to net zero emissions as a world. And until that happens, the climate impacts get more and more. So, I'm seeing sweltering here in the 5th heat wave in a row in London. And that's going to get worse and worse on average until we get to net zero emissions. And it'll stay at that point. And people know what the science is, but there's a bunch of countries that want to get things done and want to lead the transition. And there are some countries that do not want to and actively want to oppose it, particularly United States, Saudi Arabia. So therefore, the countries that want to get something done have moved to a parallel process, complementary to it, to work out actually how do we do this that's economically feasible and practical and doesn't leave anyone behind.
And what countries are part of that? Sorry, I know the first conference was in Colombia. Who's part of this coalition of the willing?
There were 57 countries. It was co-led by Colombia and the Netherlands, and then a bunch of countries from Europe, a bunch of countries from South America, and of course all the small island states are the major groupings.
We often speak to you sort of at COPs, so we're often looking for an expert to talk to at one of the big COPs, and you're often there and you're a great speaker, so we get you on. So I suppose with that sort of perspective from recent history, what has the UK's role been when it comes to international climate diplomacy? We've been one of the good guys, one of the bad guys, somewhere in the middle?
I would say overall one of the good guys on the spectrum. We obviously had a lot more power and leverage when we were part of the European Union. Now we're a bit isolated because we don't have this big group backing behind what the United Kingdom is saying. And very recently, we've had much more problematic because we've had big cuts in the aid budget. We're now down to 0.3% of GDP. That's having big impacts because the UK can't or is unwilling to contribute to mitigation, to adaptation in particular, and to the loss and damage fund, so that these massive impacts in small island states that just are very, very difficult to adapt to. How we're going to pay for that, and we can see that adaptation problem here. We have enormous issues with adaptation of our hospitals, of our farming, of our landscapes, of our homes, and who is going to pay for that? How is that going to be paid across the world? Is a very live issue and a very important one.
From what you've said so far, it sounds like you're suggesting that, Ed Miliband might have his heart in the right place. He might, I believe he genuinely cares about climate change and he's passionate about this. But the position he's going to have to put forward, or the baggage he comes with when he goes to any meeting with a foreign leader or his counterparts, foreign secretaries of other countries, is that we're a nation that's considering opening new oil and gas fields. We're a nation that's just cut our development budget from 0.7 to 0.5, then to 0.3%. And so, in fact, this is one of the worst situations Britain has ever been in recent history when it comes to our capacity to pursue climate diplomacy.
I would agree with that, except Ed Miliband is a very impressive political operator. And he's shown that in his previous role on net zero and climate, and before that when he was in government in 2008. So if someone can do something about that, he has great leverage in the Labour Party and in the cabinet to stop these two oil and gas fields and explain the kinds of impacts on the UK standing for essentially almost no jobs, no impact on bills, and very, very little income to the Treasury. It doesn't make any sense for these to go ahead on their own terms, never mind with the climate and the international perspective. And then I think on aid, the cut to 0.3% was supposed to be temporary. Now, if Ed can get some commitment about how that turns round, that would be very good. And he could also use his considerable leverage to, make the point, as he sort of is implicitly saying, what's the real threat here? Is it an invasion by Russia? I mean, currently in the UK at the moment, we've got huge fires. We've got people losing their homes to fire. We've got huge fires in agriculture and natural bits of the UK. We've got hospitals overheating. We've got train crashes. This is the kind of impact that Russia could only dream of. And it's here now because of climate change. And we're much better investing in reducing emissions and doing the adaptation and changing to electrification and renewable energy to produce that electricity and helping the world go on that direction, rather than funding ever more armaments for a much more distant threat than climate change, which the Russian threat, in my opinion, it is. It's more distant than this very real, very now climate impacts.
And so does that mean you think it's smart for, in the video Ed Miliband released yesterday, he's sort of saying, my commitment is to national security. That's the highest priority of any government. But given my highest priority is national security, that's precisely why I care so much about climate change. Do you think that's the right framing? I mean, at the extreme end, this probably won't happen, but you could imagine him sort of saying, well, you've committed to 3% of GDP on defense. Maybe if we have a more expansive notion of defense, we can put some of that towards climate investments. I'm not sure if that would get past some of the right-wing newspapers, but I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure it would get past, but I think that noting that it's a security issue for the UK, whether it's food security, whether it's our energy supply security, whether it's our ability to transport things, in these new higher temperatures and under these new climate impacts, then I think, yes, it is a national priority. And that, by saying it's national security, that's how you get buy-in from senior civil servants, buy-in from GCHQ, buy-in from other ministries, to be able to have the kind of comprehensive approach that's needed to adapt to these ever-changing conditions. Because I think we all just have to remember, and it's hard to remember, that in 10 years' time, these conditions and these impacts are going to look good unless we do something about both the emissions and adapting to this new world that we've created.
I want to talk to you sort of, I suppose, more as a climate scientist now in terms of what we can expect over the coming 12 months. Because as far as I understand, the heat wave we're seeing at the moment was largely, of course, driven by climate change and then also driven by El Nino, which is a cyclical natural phenomenon. And also my understanding is that we're kind of only in the beginning of the El Nino. So the worst could be yet to come over, say, the next 6 or 12 months. So what should we expect over the next 6 or 12 months? What will the rest of this El Nino have in store?
One correction there is that the current heat waves are not related to El Nino. It's only just getting started. These heat waves are driven by more emissions in the atmosphere, and then we always have had heat waves. But what we're having now is heat waves on top of already much higher temperatures. And therefore the spikes that we're seeing are like outside the comfort zone, outside the tolerance that UK society was built for. We have hospitals that are built for a given temperature range. And now we're increasingly going outside of that temperature range. And that's the same for all of the infrastructure that's been built up in the UK over the last, hundreds of years and certainly decades. So that it's no longer kind of exactly fit for purpose, because we're seeing is, we have a band of tolerance, and we're now poking outside that band of tolerance. In terms of the El Nino, so it's unclear whether it's going to be this strongest ever El Nino or not quite. We're still seeing how it's evolving. And the UK is not massively affected by El Ninos. It's not the kind of place like California, which has like massive changes in weather patterns, or Peru, or East Africa, and or parts of the Amazon. So what we'll mainly see, I think, is a huge impact on food production, because we will have an abnormal weather in many places of the world. So we can expect further food price inflation. We can also expect more events like this typhoon in China, where almost 1 million people were evacuated because they got a third of a year's rain in one day. So we'll just have more unusual extremes. And in some places it will be much drier, and in some places it will be much wetter. But the impact on the UK is most likely to be via food. And 2027 will guaranteed be a record year for global temperatures, almost guaranteed, because the El Nino will go on top of existing climate change. And we'll see natural ecosystems temporarily stop absorbing carbon. So we'll see a big increase in the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere staying in the atmosphere because of the change in the El Nino, and essentially the tropics will absorb less carbon than it normally does.
And why is that? I know you focus on tropical forests, so I mean maybe you can relate it to that. But why is it that hot weather means that these places won't absorb carbon? Is it because the forests burn down, or what's going on there?
It will be partly, people will use the dry it's partly because it's hot, but also dry. And the places where it's dry, then you can convert the forest to other land uses. So some people will, so cattle ranchers in South America will take that opportunity to clear additional lands to try and consolidate lands for cattle production, for example. And higher temperatures mean that respiration costs of plants are higher. So they are absorbing carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and then releasing it through respiration. And now respiration costs go up as the temperatures rise. So that's the kind of basic point. So
I'm going to put this in really stupid person's sort of language, but the plant is more stressed. It has to work harder, therefore it absorbs less carbon.
Exactly.
Perfect.
That's the perfect way of putting it.
I'm happy that you've reinforced me that was not completely a ridiculous thing to say. Let's link this up as a final question. Sort of putting aside Rosebank and Jackdaw, and I suppose putting aside the aid budget, because those are both things that Ed Miliband's going to have to negotiate with Andy Burnham. It's going to sort of be about power struggles within cabinet, I suppose. Purely as Foreign Secretary, what are the things that Ed Miliband can basically do of his own accord, just using his intellect and charm, I suppose? Does it relate to sort of protecting tropical rainforests? I mean, what can he do when he's going and meeting other global leaders?
Well, he's already announced that he's UK envoy for the World Bank, and that he is personally going to do that job rather than giving it to a junior minister. So that's really important, because the World Bank is under siege from the United States in particular to stop its climate-related finance for global South countries. So that is a very important fight internationally that Ed Miliband knows about and has put himself in the center of, because he can do a lot of good there for the climate debate. I think that's one crucial thing. And then obviously, he will be able to provide some leadership, because he's very able against Saudi Arabia and the other blockers in the international climate talks, because he's got a lot of experience of how to do that, and he's been quite effective in the past in doing that. But it's limited, but it's important that someone does it, and someone who's very passionate and able can do it.
That was Simon Lewis speaking to me earlier today. And we do have a bit of an update on this story, because Andy Burnham has said the words climate change. I'll do that one again. That was Professor Simon Lewis speaking to me earlier today. And we do have an update for you, because Andy Burnham has now today said the words climate change. It was on a visit to Stourbridge.
We have to face up to the changing climate, and I think we need a different debate about that. There's no point denying where we are. We need to face up to it. We need more clean energy. We need to see that transition accelerate. Those are all of the issues that are now in discussion. But the Cobra meeting earlier this week, I think, has enabled us to mobilise resource today to individuals, to communities, and to our fire and rescue services. And we're very, very grateful to them.
So he does still seem pretty reluctant to talk about climate change, right? So it was mentioned briefly, he talks about clean energy, but then he's obviously moving on quite quickly. Now, I suppose he thinks as Prime Minister, he's visiting people who've just sort of immediately lost their homes. He doesn't want to be seen to be making political points. Now, I don't think talking about climate change should be seen as making a political point, but clearly some people do. But yeah, just for whatever reason, this has now become habitual. He does not want to talk about this. We should say that there has been another update, which is that not only is he discouraging the use of disposable barbecues, he's banning the sale of disposable barbecues for the time being, while we're still in drought. Lots of people suggesting it's not really ambitious enough as a means to, I suppose, protect us from climate change. But also, I'm definitely not opposed to it. Disposable barbecues, when we're in a drought, do seem like an unnecessary risk. Obviously, I'd advise everyone, when you're out this weekend, don't start any unnecessary, don't start any fires, necessary or unnecessary. Have a picnic instead.